The parchment felt rough against Maeve's numbed fingers. She stood at the far end of the High Court of Oakhaven. The marble floor stretched ahead of her, reflecting the dim light from the iron chandeliers. Courtiers and pack elders lined the walls, their conversations bleeding into a steady, dull hum. At the end of the aisle sat Cillian Blackthorn. He was looking over a trade agreement, scanning the pages his beta handed him. He didn't look up when Maeve walked in. He rarely did. For 5 years, she had been treated as part of the architecture, a quiet requirement for diplomatic symmetry, expected to breathe softly and stay out of the way. Her inner wolf offered nothing. It had stopped pacing seasons ago, effectively starved out by the man on the throne. Maeve stepped forward. Her slippers were silent, but stepping into the center aisle unprompted was enough to kill the room's murmurs. Cillian finally looked up. His face held the usual disciplined coldness. A faint furrow appeared between his brows, a sign she was interrupting the schedule. Maeve stopped 10 paces from the dais. She didn't bow. She didn't bare her throat. She just unrolled the parchment, knelt, and placed it flat on the floor. With a hard push, she slid it forward. The heavy paper scraped loudly against the stone. It stopped at the base of the throne. The beta picked it up, frowned at her personal wax seal, and broke it. He read the first line and went completely pale. Cillian held out his hand. The beta passed him the paper. Cillian read it. It was the Writ of Severance. Maeve watched him stop breathing. The court was dead quiet, waiting for the inevitable roar, the alpha command that usually shook the walls when he was challenged. Maeve didn't let him have the silence. "I release you to your duty," she said. Her voice was hollow, but loud enough to carry. Cillian stood. The heavy oak chair groaned. His eyes, usually an impenetrable black, flashed crimson. Maeve didn't wait to see what he would do next. She turned her back and walked out the doors. The stables smelled like old hay and nervous horses. Maeve crouched behind a stack of grain barrels in the dark. Her chest heaved. The cold night air biting through the wooden slats was the only proof she hadn't completely dissociated. Outside, heavy boots marched past the doors. A patrol. They were moving at a standard pace. The castle hadn't realized she was truly gone yet. They probably assumed she had run to her chambers to cry. They didn't know she had hidden a travel cloak in here 3 days ago. She pressed her spine against the rough wood, waiting for the footsteps to fade. She placed a shaking hand over her stomach. Beneath the wool of her dress, a faint warmth radiated against her palm. She parted the fabric slightly. A delicate silver vein glowed beneath her pale skin for a second before fading. If the High Court knew about the baby, they wouldn't just lock her in a tower. The zealots would carve her open for the moon goddess's power. Cillian would view the child as a tactical asset to secure his borders. She would become a vault, permanently erased from her own life. "I won't let them," she whispered, her voice cracked. She pulled the dark cloak from behind the barrels and fastened it at her throat. She had maybe 8 minutes before the guard shift changed at the eastern gate. Maeve slipped out the side door, sticking to the shadows along the stone walls. The gravel crunched softly underfoot. The eastern gate was just ahead, the portcullis raised high enough to let a supply cart through. She was 20 yards away when the bells started. A massive chime rang from the highest tower, then another. The frantic tolling vibrated in her teeth. They knew. Torches flared along the battlements, shouts erupted from the barracks, the roar of an Alpha's command echoed from the keep, rattling the loose stones in the wall. Maeve bolted. Her lungs tasted like copper. The forest floor was a mess of slick moss and twisted roots. Maeve scrambled up an embankment, her fingers digging into the freezing dirt. Her muscles screamed, begging for the strength of a wolf that was no longer there. Behind her, the howling of the king's vanguard tore through the trees. They were tracking her. The elite guards of Oakhaven didn't even need a scent trail. They moved as a unit, directed by Cillian's will. Branches snapped closer with every heartbeat. Ahead, the trees suddenly broke, revealing a stark clearing. The ash line. A thick strip of gray powder stretched across the dirt. Beyond it lay the Wildlands, a lawless territory where the kingdom's magic warped. Wolves went there to disappear. Maeve lunged for the boundary. A snarl erupted directly behind her. She threw herself forward, tumbling across the gray powder. The second her hands hit the dark soil of the Wildlands, the alarm bells snapped into total silence. Gasping, Maeve pushed herself up and looked back. A black wolf burst from the tree line. He slammed on his brakes, his paws tearing up the dirt inches from the ash line. He let out a roar that shook the branches, but he didn't cross. The ancient laws binding his crown held him back. He paced the boundary, staring at her through the gloom. Maeve stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees, her chest heaving, the magic beneath her skin pulsing in time with her heart. She was out. She turned away from him and faced the Wildlands. A wet growl vibrated from the shadows directly in front of her. The smell of rotting leaves flooded the air. A pair of pale, milky eyes opened in the dark. Maeve didn't scream. Screaming was a prey response, and whatever was crouching in the brush was waiting for it. The milky eyes hovered 3 feet off the ground. She stepped backward, slowly. The eyes tracked her. A wet, clicking sound echoed from the dark. Maeve turned and ran. The Wildlands swallowed her. The canopy blotted out the moon, plunging the woods into blackness. She ran blindly, her hands outstretched to deflect the jagged branches that tore at her cloak. The ground beneath her boots felt spongy and wrong. The temperature plummeted, stealing her breath in ragged white plumes. She needed shelter. Her human eyes couldn't navigate the dead wood, but she felt a rock face scrape against her shoulder. She traced the freezing stone until her fingers found a fissure, barely deep enough to be called a cave. She squeezed inside just as the snow began to fall. It smelled faintly of sulfur. Maeve sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. Her teeth chattered violently. The wool cloak was already stiffening with frost. Hypothermia out here wouldn't take hours. She closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for the familiar golden warmth of her wolf to act as a furnace against the cold. Nothing. There was no answering growl, no heat, just an echoing emptiness. Cillian's years of polite indifference hadn't just broken her heart, they had starved her soul. She was trapped in the deadliest forest on the continent, in a failing human body. A tear slipped down her cheek, turning to ice, almost instantly. She bowed her head, the grief pressing down heavily on her chest. In the deepest corner of the cave, the darkness detached itself from the wall. The cold vanished, replaced by a paralyzing numbness. Maeve's head snapped up. The shadow didn't have a distinct shape. It was a mass of concentrated night creeping across the floor. A shadow stalker. It didn't hunt for flesh. As it slithered closer, the air grew dense with the emotional weight of her worst memories. The numbness in her limbs wasn't frost. It was the exact feeling of sitting alone in the dining hall on her 5th anniversary. The stalker rose off the floor. The milky eyes opened in the center of the mass. It reached out a formless tendril, brushing against her cheek. The contact sent a shockwave of misery into her brain. Her vision blurred. The urge to just lie down on the freezing stone and let it consume her was overpowering. It would be so easy. The baby. The thought cut through the despair. Her hand shot up to her hair, fumbling against the heavy silver hairpin holding her braids. It was a royal heirloom from Cillian's mother. She ripped it free. As the stalker leaned in, its jaw unhinging to reveal a lightless void, Maeve drove the 4-inch silver spike directly into its milky eye. The creature shrieked, the sound shattering the frost on the cave walls. Where the silver touched, the shadow boiled into oily smoke. Maeve didn't wait to see if it would reform. She scrambled out of the cave. She crashed through the thick brush and stumbled onto a jagged ridgeline of black glass. Obsidian Ridge. The wind howled up here, threatening to throw her over the sheer drop on either side. She stopped, clutching her side, the bloody hairpin still gripped in her fist. Then the wind shifted. She smelled winter pine. Her blood ran cold. You have made your point, Maeve. Cillian stood at the edge of the tree line, 20 yards away. He had shifted back to his human form. He was alone, wearing dark leather armor, the silver clasps gleaming. Alpha Kings didn't cross the ash line. The treaty was absolute. Yet here he was. Step away from the ledge, he ordered. The alpha command layered beneath his words pressed against her skin, an invisible weight trying to force her compliance. Maeve planted her boots. You shouldn't have followed me. Cillian began to walk toward her, his boots crushing the obsidian. This tantrum ends here. The council is in an uproar. You will return to Oakhaven, sit on your throne, and explain that the document was a mistake. He didn't know. He just saw a wife throwing a political fit. It wasn't a mistake, she said. Her voice dropped to a flat register. The severance is legal. He stopped 10 paces away, his jaw tight. Nothing is done until I say it is done. You belong to the crown. I belonged to you, Maeve corrected. But you forgot where you put me. You don't get to demand my return just because you finally noticed the shelf is empty. Cillian's eyes narrowed. For a man who relied entirely on structure, her open defiance was breaking his logic apart. He took another step forward. I will not ask you again, he said, reaching out a hand. Come here. No. Cillian lunged. He moved with the speed of an apex predator, but his focus was entirely on her, blinding him to the environment. As his boots hit the center of the ridge, the obsidian groaned. The Wildlands didn't tolerate the weight of an Alpha King. A deafening crack echoed across the mountainside. The black stone between them splintered. The ridge collapsed. The ground vanished, pulling Maeve backward into the chasm, taking the furious king down with her. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. Ice water swallowed Maeve instantly. The current of the subterranean river dragged her deep into the trench. She thrashed against the weight of her soaked cloak, her human limbs sluggish against the pressure. She opened her mouth to scream, and the river rushed in. It tasted like old iron. The moment the water filled her throat, the darkness shattered. She was standing in a vast white void, and the center stood a wolf, the size of a nightmare. Cillian's wolf. But it was chained to the floor. Rusted iron links wrapped around its throat and paws, glowing with the sickly pale light. Runes of duty and logic. The beast tore at the chains, bleeding from its frantic attempts to break free. The water in Maeve's ears distorted into echoing voices. The king does not feel. Tear out the heart, or the kingdom falls. Then she heard her own voice crying, a memory of her 3rd year in Oakhaven. In the vision, Cillian's chained wolf heard her crying and threw itself violently toward the sound, desperate to reach her. The iron chains snapped taut. The runes flared. The wolf was slammed back to the ground, choked into submission. He hadn't been indifferent. He was a prisoner in his own mind. The bitterness that had armored her heart cracked. She felt a sudden wave of pity. He was a monster built by a curse. Her lungs burned. The vision faded into tunneling blackness. A heavy hand closed around her collar. With a violent heave, Maeve was ripped from the water and dragged into the freezing air. Maeve collapsed onto the rocky shore, vomiting water. Her body convulsed. The cavern air sliced through her wet clothing. She curled into a ball, her teeth clicking together. Cillian dropped to his knees beside her. He was drenched, his chest heaving. He reached for his belt, fumbling with the heavy iron flint. He struck it against the cavern wall. A tiny spark caught a patch of dry moss. A struggling flame flickered to life. "Come here," Cillian ordered. His voice was hoarse. Maeve flinched away, dragging herself against the whetstone. Knowing why he was broken didn't make him safe. "I said come here." He didn't wait for her consent. He moved across the rocks, wrapped his arms around her, and pulled her flush against his chest. She struggled weakly, but he locked her in place. His body heat was staggering. He wrapped his heavy leather coat around them both, burying her face in the crook of his neck. "Stop fighting me," he whispered harshly. "You're entering shock." She went still out of biological necessity. The heat bleeding from his chest was the only thing keeping her heart beating. As her shivering subsided, the wet wool of her torn bodice slipped. In the dim light, the silver vein beneath her collarbone pulsed. Cillian's breathing stopped. He pulled back just enough to look down, his dark eyes locked onto the glowing magic. The Alpha King stared at the light of the vessel with naked shock. "What is that?" Maeve pulled the torn wool tightly across her chest. "It's the reason I left." Before Cillian could process it, the cavern floor began to vibrate. A rhythmic drumming echoed from the pitch-black tunnels. The drumming was the synchronized footfalls of a hunting party. Cillian stood up, pulling Maeve behind him. The scent of rancid meat and wet fur hit them a second later. "Northern wastes," Cillian murmured. He drew the silver broadsword strapped to his thigh. "Stay against the wall." 5 wolves stepped out of the darkness. They were scarred and feral, drawn by the beacon pulsing in Maeve's blood. The lead wolf, missing half an ear, locked its yellow eyes on Maeve. "The vessel," it snarled. Cillian didn't issue a warning. He attacked. He cleaved the first wolf down the center before it could lunge. The cavern erupted into chaos of snapping jaws and ringing steel. Maeve pressed her spine against the rock, hands covering her stomach. Cillian blocked a set of jaws with his forearm, driving his blade up through the creature's ribs. But the confined space neutralized his reach. A third wolf snapped at his shoulder. Cillian drove his elbow backward, crushing its skull. In that distraction, the largest tracker bypassed him and launched straight at Maeve. The jaws opened, aiming for her throat. A blur of dark leather intercepted the strike. Cillian threw his body in front of her. The tracker's jaws clamped down, tearing directly into his unprotected side. Cillian didn't scream. He drove his sword downward, pinning the wolf to the floor. The beast spasmed and died. The cavern went silent. All 5 trackers were dead. Cillian stood for a moment, his sword slipping from his fingers. He looked back at Maeve, checking to see if she was untouched. Then his knees buckled and he collapsed. Dead weight. That was the only way to describe the king as Maeve dragged him out of the cavern and into the wildlands. Her muscles tore with the effort of pulling him by the lapels of his ruined armor. He left a trail of blood that smelt like rust in the freezing air. "Don't you dare die," she hissed, her boots slipping on the moss. She hauled him into a hidden grove of pale trees and let him drop. Maeve collapsed beside him and ripped his jacket open. The wound was catastrophic. The jaws had torn through the muscle of his side. She waited for the unnatural heat of his healing factor to knit the flesh back together. Nothing happened. His skin was turning the color of ash. The Wildlands was actively choking his alpha blood. Panic spiked in her throat. If he died here, the packs hunting her would tear her apart. She looked at the bioluminescent flora clinging to the tree roots. She remembered her first year in Oakhaven, locked in the library, memorizing botany she was never allowed to use. Silver leaf fenugreek, blood moss. Maeve scrambled across the dirt. She tore handfuls of the damp moss from the roots, threw them into a hollow depression in a stone, and grabbed a smooth river rock. She ground the herbs into a thick paste with frantic competence. She scooped the poultice up and pressed it directly into the tearing wound on Cillian's side. His body spasmed violently. A low groan tore from his throat. Maeve leaned her weight onto her hands, forcing the paste deep into the tissue to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," she ordered. "Breathe." Cillian's eyes snapped open. They were clouded with agony. He looked up at the woman covered in dirt and his blood, holding him back from death. He didn't look at her like a wife. He looked at her like a savior. "You are covered in blood." Cillian's voice was a metallic rasp. He tried to push himself up, his face contorting. Maeve sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead. The small fire she had built cast shadows against the white trees. "Lie down. A moss needs time." He ignored her, forcing himself upright against a tree trunk. Even shattered, he tried to dominate the space. He looked around the grove, calculating their vulnerability. "This position is compromised," he stated. He looked at the faint silver light hidden beneath her cloak. "The beacon in your blood drew the Northerners. It will draw more." "I survived tonight," Maeve countered. "Because I intervened," he coughed. "My healing is stunted. I cannot protect you if a larger pack arrives." He slipped back into command. "At first light, you will take my cloak and blade. You will return to Oakhaven." Maeve stared at him. "I will hold the pass," he added, offering his life as a tactical delay. "The High Council will secure you. You will be safe." Maeve laughed, a broken, jagged sound. "Safe?" She stood up, towering over him, the dam holding back 5 years of grief finally shattered. "The Wildlands are what I need saving from? I was dying in your perfect castle, Cillian. I sat at your polished tables, and I slowly ceased to exist." "Maeve." "I am not finished." Her tone pinned him to the tree. "You gave me everything except a reason to breathe. You starved my inner wolf by treating me like an asset. I stopped dreaming." She stepped closer, tears shining in her eyes. "You didn't break me with cruelty, Cillian. You erased me with your absence." Cillian stopped breathing. The curse of logic that bound his mind couldn't compute the reality of her truth. He saw the empty dinners, the profound isolation. He hadn't protected her, he had buried her alive. The Alpha King slowly slid down the trunk of the tree. He pitched forward, bracing his hands against the dirt, and dropped his head. He knelt before her, completely shattered. Dawn broke, bleeding weak light through the canopy. Maeve stood shivering near the dying fire. Her chest felt incredibly light. The heavy stone of unspoken grief was gone, left in the dirt at Cillian's feet. She took a deep breath. For the first time in 3 years, she smelled the distinct scent of pine needles buried under the snow. Human noses couldn't isolate a scent like that from 50 yards away. A sudden pressure bloomed behind her ribs. Not pain, but a spark. Wine. The sound echoed inside her mind. Maeve gasped, a disbelieving laugh tearing from her throat. Her inner wolf was alive. The catharsis of forcing him to see her pain had cleared the wreckage. But the magic inside her did not belong solely to the wolf. The moment the feral spark ignited, the vessel beneath her heart reacted. Maeve gasped as a surge of heat shot outward. The silver veins across her skin erupted. A brilliant pillar of light burst from her chest, piercing the canopy and shooting into the dawn sky. Cillian threw his arm over his eyes against the flash. The light faded, but the damage was done. The magic had been broadcast to every nightmare in the territory. From the distant peaks, a synchronized howl rose into the morning air. It wasn't 5 wolves this time. It was an army. The howl multiplied, vibrating with the promise of slaughter. Maeve grabbed Cillian's arm, hauling him to his feet. He staggered, his face pale. The blood seeping through the moss poultice was black. "Move," she ordered. She dragged him through the treacherous terrain of the obsidian ridge. Behind them, the snapping of branches and guttural barks grew closer. "Leave me," Cillian ground out, stumbling. "If I hold the choke point." "If you stop walking, I will drag you by your hair," Maeve snapped. "You do not get to choose how this ends." Through the skeletal trees, a structure loomed against the cliffside. It was a ruin of pale marble, a temple of the moon abandoned during the first Alpha Wars. "The temple," he wheezed. "It's sealed. Only a Luna—" A trailed off, his knees buckling. Maeve practically carried him up the marble steps. She could smell the wet fur of the pack breaking through the tree line. She reached the enormous stone doors. There was no handle. She pressed her bloody palms flat against the cold stone. "Please." The silver veins flared. The light traveled down her arms, pouring into the stone. A grinding boom shook the mountain. The doors split down the center and slid open. Maeve dragged Cillian inside just as the first northern wolf bounded up the steps. The doors slammed shut behind them, locking the monsters outside. Maeve dropped to the floor, gasping. The entry hall was lined with towering statues of the first Luna queens. A terrifying grinding noise echoed through the hall as the stone heads slowly turned, their blank eyes looking down at her. The statues just watched. Maeve scrambled backward, but Cillian's groan pulled her attention away. He was lying on his side, his breathing shallow. The dark poison was spreading through his veins. "The sanctum," he whispered. "There is a spring." Maeve hauled him up again. They stumbled past the statues, descending a wide staircase into the heart of the mountain. The inner sanctum was a circular chamber. In the center sat a deep, dry basin. Above it hung a massive valve made entirely of pure silver, a barrier designed to keep alphas away from the sacred water. Maeve guided Cillian to the edge of the basin. He collapsed against the rim, coughing up dark blood. "It's dry," Maeve said, staring up at the silver wheel. "I can't turn it. I'm not strong enough." Cillian forced his eyes open. To an alpha, pure silver stripped away their aura, shredding their power. Touching it willingly was an act of absolute submission. He gripped the edge of the basin and hauled himself to his feet. "No," Maeve stepped forward. "The silver will tear your aura apart." He looked down at her with desperate devotion. "Good," he rasped. He wrapped both of his hands around the sacred silver wheel. The hiss of burning flesh echoed in the chamber. Thick smoke poured from his hands. The silver glowed white hot, rejecting the alpha magic. His body went rigid as he absorbed the agony. "Look away, Maeve," he commanded through gritted teeth. He threw his failing weight against the wheel. It turned with a heavy clank. Cillian collapsed backward onto the floor, his hands charred black. From the ceiling, clear water cascaded down, filling the basin. Maeve fell to her knees beside him. "Why did you do that?" "He became the sanctum." The water called to her, tugging at the terrified spark of the wolf deep in her chest. Maeve stood up and stepped down into the glowing pool. The freezing water clinging to her clothes was neutralized by the warmth of the spring. She waded in until the water reached her chest. She let herself sink beneath the surface. The magic bypassed her flesh entirely, diving straight into her fractured soul. The terrified spark of her inner wolf was hit with a tidal wave of lunar energy. It roared into an inferno. Maeve broke the surface, gasping. Her senses snapped back online with an intensity that bordered on pain. She could see the fault lines in the marble. She could hear the claws of the northern pack digging at the doors above. And she could smell Cillian. Without his alpha aura shielding his emotions, she smelled the truth of him. Desperation and suffocating regret. He hadn't just been a cold jailer. He had been a prisoner. And the moment the chains slipped, he had burned himself alive to give her a chance to breathe. Maeve stood up in the basin. She opened her eyes. The hollow brown of her human gaze was gone, replaced by a predatory gold. Her inner wolf was fully awake. But as the wolf's golden eyes locked onto the unconscious king on the floor, the memory of starvation slammed into the beast. A low, guttural snarl tore from Maeve's throat. The snarl didn't belong to Maeve. Her human mind had rationalized his neglect, but the beast had been locked in a lightless box. The spring resurrected the wolf, and it resurrected the trauma right alongside it. Maeve's vision tinted gold. She vaulted out of the basin, landing silently on the stone floor. She dropped to all fours, her fingers curling into claws against the marble. Cillian stirred. He forced his eyes open, expecting to see his human wife. Instead, he saw the predator he had destroyed. The wolf lunged. Maeve screamed internally, a frantic command to stop. But the wolf wanted its pound of flesh. She crashed into his chest, pinning him to the floor. He didn't fight back. He didn't raise his ruined hands. He simply tilted his head back and exposed his throat. Maeve's jaw snapped down. Her teeth sank into the muscle of his neck. Hot blood flooded her mouth. Cillian let out a choked gasp, but he didn't move. Slowly, he lifted one blackened hand and rested his fingers gently against her wet hair. "It's okay," he whispered. "I let you." The unconditional surrender pierced through the feral rage. The beast didn't know what to do with a king who willingly offered his life as an apology. Control snapped back to Maeve. She released his throat and scrambled backward, her chest heaving. Her lips were coated in his blood. Cillian lay on the marble, bleeding profusely from the bite mark, his eyes locked on hers with devastating peace. "No," Maeve choked out, horror swallowing the wolf's vengeance. I didn't mean to." She crawled back toward him, tearing the dry fabric from the hem of her underdress to apply pressure. She reached for his neck, but Cillian caught her wrist with his burnt hand. "Leave it," he commanded softly. "You're bleeding out. Let me help you." "You did exactly what you should have done," he said calmly. "I killed your wolf, Maeve. The blood price was mine." "I don't want your blood." "I know." He let his hand fall back to the stone. "You just wanted me to see you, and I was too blind." He closed his eyes. The air in the sanctum grew heavy. "In the high court of Oakhaven," Cillian spoke, his voice echoing with formal cadence, "I presented the writ of severance." "Cillian, stop!" He used the last fraction of his strength to perform his final duty. "I, Cillian Blackthorn, accept the dissolution of this union. I sever my claim to your heart. I sever my claim to your wolf. I set you free." Deep inside Maeve's chest, the mate bond pulled violently taut and snapped. The golden thread evaporated. The intrinsic knowledge of his presence vanished. She was completely alone. Cillian opened his eyes. The alpha command was gone. "You are free, Maeve," he rasped, struggling to push himself up. "I will guard that door until I die." Before she could process the weight of her freedom, the mountain screamed. A catastrophic boom shook the inner sanctum. The stone doors of the temple had cracked. The second impact was louder, followed by splintering stone. "They're through," Cillian said. His voice held only tactical finality. He forced his way to his feet. His body was a ruin. The tracker's bite was seeping poison. His hands were charred, and his throat was torn. The strength provided by the mate bond was gone. He staggered toward the wide stone staircase leading to the entry hall. "Cillian, you can't!" Maeve screamed. "There are 30 of them." He didn't answer. He picked up his silver broadsword, his ruined hands wrapped around the hilt, fresh blood sizzling against the metal. He stepped onto the landing, placing himself in the center of the archway. From the hall above, a final explosion of marble echoed. The heavy doors collapsed inward. Through the dust, the northern pack poured in. They shifted into their scarred human forms, armed with jagged spears and iron axes. 30 seasoned killers, their eyes fixed on the silver light from below. The Northern Alpha stepped to the front, a giant draped in furs. "The crown has no power here, Blackthorn. Step aside. We only want the vessel." Cillian leveled the blood-slicked blade directly at the Alpha's chest. "Then come take her." The Northern Alpha smiled. He hurled his heavy iron spear down the staircase with terrifying velocity. Maeve screamed as the iron shaft buried itself deeply into the center of Cillian's chest. The force of the spear lifted him off his feet, driving him backward onto the marble stairs. The broadsword clattered away. He lay pinned to the stone. A ragged cheer erupted from the northern pack. They surged forward, their boots thundering down the stairs, axes raised to claim the trembling woman below. Maeve didn't tremble. The human terror evaporated. She looked at the man who had just severed his own soul to set her free, trading his life for her autonomy. She would not let him die for it. A primal roar tore from her throat, the fury of a mother and a mate. She charged up the staircase, stepping in front of Cillian's bleeding body, spreading her arms wide. The Northern Alpha laughed, raising his axe. "Stupid bitch!" He swung the blade down. It never landed. The silver veins beneath Maeve's skin detonated. An explosion of lunar light flooded the cavern with the radiance so intense it cast no shadows. A high-pitched frequency silenced the battle cries instantly. Maeve didn't look human. Her eyes were solid silver. The power of the moon goddess recognized the threat to its vessel. She looked down at the army. "Kneel." The word drove into the marrow of their bones. The Northern Alpha tried to step backward. The moment his boot shifted, the light hit the front line like a physical wall. The massive Alpha disintegrated. His flesh and armor turned to great ash, blowing away in a sudden gust of wind. The killers behind him screamed, dropping their weapons and fleeing. The light chased them. In seconds, the thunderous footfalls vanished, replaced by dust settling on cold marble. The light receded. Maeve's knees buckled immediately, leaving her human, exhausted, and scrambling across the steps to reach Cillian. "Cillian!" Maeve sobbed, dropping beside him. His eyes were open but unseeing. The blood pooling beneath him was sluggish. She grabbed the wooden shaft of the spear, trying to pull it, but the barb was lodged deep. "Don't," he breathed, a wet rattle in his throat. "It's holding. The artery?" "I can fix this," she lied frantically. She pressed her hands flat against his chest, pulling at the magic, demanding it heal him. The silver veins flickered, but the light was cold. It didn't knit his flesh. His soul was already detaching from his body. "Maeve!" The voice didn't come from Cillian. It came from her own mouth. A vast, ancient presence flooded her mind. His vessel is broken." The iron of his curse has poisoned the blood. To heal the flesh is not enough. The soul must be anchored. Cillian's eyes locked onto her face. He recognized the divine presence. How? Maeve pleaded internally. An equal exchange. The alpha ping must tear away the half of his soul poisoned by dominance. He must surrender his supremacy forever. The terms hung heavy in the quiet temple. You will fuse his broken half to your resurrected wolf. You will share a single soul. But he will never be the absolute sovereign again. He will be only half a king. She was offering him the one thing he had been raised to protect above all else. Cillian didn't hesitate. He looked at the woman who had just burned an army to ash for him. "Take it all," he commanded. Maeve leaned down, pressing her lips against his. She pulled the divine magic from her stomach, pushing it violently up through her chest and straight into him. A blinding flash of mixed gold and silver light exploded behind her eyes. The temple vanished. Maeve stood in the center of the vast white void. A few yards away stood Cillian's wolf, chained to the floor and dying. Maeve felt the shift inside her soul. The golden, furious wolf that had awakened in the spring materialized beside her. It walked slowly toward the dying alpha. It didn't bare its teeth or submit. It walked as an equal. Her wolf lowered its head and pressed its golden muzzle against the rusted iron collar, choking his throat. The ancient curse was built on emotional suppression. It was not designed to withstand unconditional forgiveness. The iron cracked. The runes of logic burned out. The chains shattered into harmless mist. Cillian's wolf surged to its feet, entirely free. The two wolves circled each other, their auras bleeding together, the dark shadow merging seamlessly with the bright lunar gold. They leaned into one another, supporting the exact same weight. In the silence, Maeve heard two distinct heartbeats, erratic and out of rhythm. As the auras fused, the heartbeats began to slow. They synced until there was only one steady rhythm. A bond forged not by bloodline, but by a desperate mutual choice. True mates. Equals. The white void collapsed rapidly inward. Maeve gasped. Her eyes snapped open in the physical world. The iron spear was gone, dissolved by the magic. The jagged tear in his chest was completely closed, leaving only a pale scar. Cillian's chest rose in a deep breath. He opened his eyes. The pitch-black darkness was gone, replaced by a swirling mixture of gold and silver. The curse was dead. The man was saved. But a chilling breeze blew down the stairs, carrying the unmistakable scent of Oakhaven armor. The kingdom he abandoned was finally at the door. The walk back to the edge of the Wildlands took 3 days, but it felt like 3 heartbeats. For the first time, the silence between them was a shared sanctuary. She didn't walk behind him, she walked beside him. But as the skeletal trees began to thin, revealing the ash line, the peace shattered. The kingdom of Oakhaven was waiting. 1,000 heavily armored guards stood in formation across the border. At the front stood the 3 senior elders. The scent of oiled steel and nervous sweat flooded the air. A month ago, the sight of this army would have driven her to her knees in terror. Now, she just felt a profound calm. She stopped at the edge of the ash line. Cillian stopped an inch to her left. "You have crossed the boundary, Alpha," the lead elder barked. "The council demands your immediate return to the capital. The Luna will be escorted to the high tower until the vessel is secured." The High Council stared at the dirt, paralyzed. The Alpha King had just discarded the Empire. "The throne is yours," the lead elder gasped. "You cannot leave it empty. The structure will collapse." "Then let it collapse," Cillian answered. His voice was quiet, carrying effortlessly over the bowed heads. The structure was a prison, built on the starvation of our mates and the suppression of our souls. "You are throwing away your legacy." "No." Cillian tightened his grip on Maeve's hand. "I am finally building one." The elder looked frantically at Maeve, expecting her to play the role of the dutiful Luna. Maeve looked down at him. Her eyes flashed gold. "The High Council is dismissed," she said. It wasn't borrowed power. It was her own. "When we are ready to govern, we will rebuild the laws as equals, not before." "But the kingdom needs its king," the elder pleaded. Cillian turned his focus entirely on Maeve. He reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "The kingdom can wait," he said softly. "My queen cannot." They turned their backs on the High Council. They didn't look back as they walked away, leaving the royal army kneeling in the dust of their own broken laws. The seasons began to blur. The skeletal trees of the borderlands vanished, replaced by the lush canopies of the southern coast. Time moved in shared laughter, the slow swelling of Maeve's stomach, and the quiet peace of a soul fully inhabited. The afternoon sun felt warm against Maeve's skin. She stood on the wooden porch of a small cottage, a mug of tea warming her hands. The scent of blooming jasmine filled the air, erasing the memory of cold marble. There were no courtiers here, just a patch of wildflowers, a low stone wall, and the two people who made up her world. A few yards away, the former Alpha King was on his hands and knees in the dirt. Cillian wore a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing the pale scar over his heart. His hands were carefully balancing a smooth river stone on top of a small pile of pebbles. Beside him sat a 4-year-old girl. She was covered in mud, with a streak of dirt across her nose and a fistful of dandelions in her hand. Maeve watched in silence. She remembered the day she had severed the bond, handing her life over to a man rigidly consumed by duty. Now he was entirely consumed by the tiny structure crumbling under his daughter's hands. The little girl patted a final pebble into place. She looked up at the massive, scarred man beside her. "Is it perfect, Papa?" she asked. Cillian looked at his daughter's face, a slow smile breaking across his features. "It's exactly right." He turned his head, his gaze tracking up to the porch. He found Maeve instantly. Through the quiet hum of their shared soul, Maeve felt the weight of his devotion. He wasn't thinking about tomorrow. He wasn't guarding an empire. He was exactly where he belonged. Maeve smiled back, letting her inner wolf rest in the sun. She was finally, truly seen.